you wanna say about us? You can laugh at our courage, take this much. To have and to hold, continue to climb. There are hundreds more just like us.
Given that the ability of an idea to relate to another idea, any specific idea or a general framework of ideas, was the primary priority for the development of that idea, we must concede. And as we look at conception and conceptualization as a system, I think we can rightly concede that it does so reasonably well. And here we find that this system of concept relating to concept, of derivations spinning off other derivations, syntheses occurring, analyses occurring, concepts being aggregated, amalgamated, deconstructed, is very closely reflective of what we would call almost a world with existent natural law, even as we must, in the context of this, consider, say, physics as more accurately a representation of how human beings shape interpretation than a direct interpretation of the physical world itself and the motion of bodies therein. We find that the way that physics, say, relates to mathematics, and the way that mathematics relates to histology, and the way that histology relates to biology, and the way that biology relates to poetry, and the way that poetry relates to conversant language, and the way that conversant language relates to so on and so forth, that this does represent a physics, that this does represent a world unto itself. And just as our interpretations of the physical world surrounding us fall and fail on imposition of pattern and the necessity to rely on generality for contextualization and correlation of that discipline to others, so too do we find that our interpretation of this conceptual world falls and fails on the same problems and the same principles, because we would seek to interpret this through the same mechanisms with which we would seek to interpret the physical world. This conceptual space still eludes us in precisely the same way to precisely the same degree. And further, we find that we must, by virtue of our position as perhaps a point of differentiation, we must consider it separate from the physical world to some degree. There is one point of shared correlation between a space concerned with physicality, a space concerned with material and materia, and a space concerned with meaning, a space concerned with significance, a space constructed of not physical bodies, but conceptual ones. There's one point of shared correlation, and that is us. There are many metaphors that we could apply here. We could say that we are acting as a lens. We could say that we are that surface of water which appears mirrored from both sides. And ultimately, any metaphor that we come up with is going to be far more poetic than illuminating, I think. The point being that we are the point of interface. We are the point of correlation. And rightly so, because we are directly responsible as a species, as sentient bodies, as sentient beings. We are directly responsible for the existence of this conceptual space. Now, it may sound like I'm getting into some sort of property dualism here. where we would seek to approach human consciousness as some sort of trans-spiritual animus or ghost in the machine, or necessary extrapolation from neurological activity for a point of self-reference, creates concepts, so on and so on and so forth. And that's not actually where I'm going with this, quite the opposite. Well, a few principles need to be outlined. First, the human being experiences these things, these two spaces, simultaneously. And with a degree of simultaneity that the distinction between them is difficult. To such a degree that in terms of one's actual experience, there are times when they should and would be considered interchangeable. The distinction between concept and physical object, or I think more pertinent, more relevant, the distinction between conceptual event and physical event has always been a problematic one for the human being. And we don't have to look very far to find examples of an extreme breakdown of the distinction between the two. And even in the most clear, the most succinct, distinct, and distinguishing, we find some synthesis between the two. Some correlation, some commingling. Second, we find that our relative positions in these two spaces are very, very similar. We find that much as we are incapable of freely defining the laws of physics to suit our needs, so too are we incapable of freely defining the ways in which the human mind shapes ideas. Much as we cannot will ourselves to fly, or do not. Again, a cannot-do-not distinction is more a point of syntax than any sort of epistema. The ability to will a different sort of cognitive capacity is similarly beyond us, which is not to say that they do not occur, which is not to say that we do not encounter these, but we cannot necessarily say that our introduction to a new means of fashioning ideas came about as the direct result of our manipulation of conceptual space. Third, and this is key, and I think once we've got this, we're free to move on. Conceptual space, a conceptual world, presents the same sort of existential paradoxes that a physical world does. Further compounded, perhaps, by the momentary illusion of some sort of absolute authority over concept, at least the concept that exists within one's own thoughts. There is context in either case. There is, well, the essence of the existential problem is that one comes into a world already existent. And here, the two are equivalent, even interchangeable.